When Dr. David Mills discovers a mysterious coffin washed ashore, he has no idea it will unravel a chilling connection between his family and a long-buried tragedy. As strange events unfold, past and present collide, forcing David to confront haunting secrets and forces that defy explanation. The morning was everything David Mills needed: a crisp breeze coming off the ocean, the rhythmic sound of his feet against the sand, and the silence that came with solitude. This part of the beach was rarely disturbed, a quiet corner of the world where even the sea seemed to soften its roar. He'd been jogging the same route for years, a ritual that helped clear the clutter from his mind before a long day at the clinic. On most days, the only things to greet him were the waves and the scattered gulls in search of breakfast. But not today. Today, something else had appeared on the shore, disrupting the tranquility like a jagged stone in a still pond. David slowed to a stop, squinting ahead as he saw the outline of something large and dark lying half buried in the sand. At first, it looked like driftwood, maybe a piece of debris from a boat. But as he drew closer, he felt a strange unease settle in his chest. This wasn't driftwood. This was something else. A coffin. His breath hitched, the steady rhythm of his jog replaced by a cold tightness in his chest. It was weathered, the wood swollen and cracked from too much time at sea. The lid, slightly ajar, revealed just enough to make David's stomach churn. For a moment, he stood frozen, staring at it. The coffin had no business being there. The sea might bring strange things to shore now and again, but this was too strange. Instinct took over. His hand went to his pocket, fumbling for his phone as he quickly dialed the police. "There's something you'll want to see down here," he said, his voice steady despite the disquiet thrumming under his skin. The police arrived swiftly, their presence cutting through the peaceful morning with the flashing lights of their squad cars and the low murmur of radios. David stood off to the side, watching as the officers approached the coffin with professional wariness. A part of him wished they'd ask him to leave, tell him this was none of his concern, but they didn't. He remained there, rooted to the spot, unable to tear himself away. One of the officers, a grizzled man with gray streaking through his hair, moved in closer. He bent over, inspecting the cracked edges of the coffin before signaling to a younger officer beside him. With gloved hands, they carefully pried the lid open the rest of the way. David held his breath, half expecting to see something awful, a body, waterlogged and pale, swollen from the sea. But instead, the contents inside were far stranger. There was no body, no skeletal remains. Just a collection of personal items, like someone had packed away the memories of a life lived too briefly. A child's toy, a weathered journal, and several old black and white photographs. David moved in closer, curious in spite of the unease still gripping him. The officers carefully pulled the items from the coffin, laying them out on the sand as they catalogued everything with the practiced precision of people who had done this before. The toy was simple, a small wooden airplane, its wings chipped and worn from age. David felt a pang in his chest looking at it, imagining a child's small hand gripping it, making it soar through the air with the kind of wild abandon only children knew. Next came the journal, the edges water-damaged, but still intact. The officer flipped it open carefully, revealing page after page of handwritten entries, some too blurred by the sea to read, others still legible. The words were intimate, personal. Whoever had written it had done so with care, with feeling. It was a life captured in ink, though the details of that life remained a mystery for now. But it was the photographs that made David pause. The images were old, their corners frayed and yellowed with time. One by one, the officers laid them out, revealing snapshots of a family, smiling faces frozen in time, a mother and father standing proudly behind a boy on a swing. But it was that boy, in one particular photograph, that tugged at something deep within David. The boy sat on the swing, his feet just barely touching the ground, his face angled toward the camera with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His clothes were simple, his hair neatly combed, but there was something about the look in his eyes, something haunting, that sent a chill down David's spine. He couldn't explain it, but there was something familiar about the boy. Not in a way that suggested they'd met before, David was certain of that, but in a way that made it feel like he should know him. Like the boy was part of a memory he couldn't quite reach. "Recognize anything?" one of the officers asked, glancing up at him. David shook his head slowly. "No. Not really. But that boy, there's something about him." The officer followed his gaze to the photograph. "Yeah," he muttered, "it's unsettling. I've been doing this job for 20 years, and you think you've seen everything, but this," he trailed off, shaking his head as if he couldn't quite put into words what they were all feeling. David wanted to walk away, to leave this strange mystery in the hands of the police, but he couldn't. His mind kept circling back to the photograph, the boy's face, the inexplicable sense of connection he felt to a child he'd never met. The image had lodged itself in his brain, and the harder he tried to push it away, the more it tightened its grip. "You're good to go, Doc," the officer said, standing up and brushing the sand from his gloves. "We'll take it from here." David nodded, but as he turned to leave, his eyes flicked back to the boy in the photograph one last time. Something in him knew, in a way that was both irrational and undeniable, that this wasn't over. Whatever had brought that coffin to shore, whatever had placed those belongings inside it, hadn't just sent a mystery, it had sent a message. And David wasn't sure he was ready to hear it. Days after the coffin's unsettling discovery, David Mills resumed his routine. The beach, once a place of solace, now seemed shadowed by an invisible weight. The quiet mornings helped clear his head, but despite his best efforts, the image of the boy on the swing crept back into his thoughts, uninvited and persistent. There was something about that face, the eyes that seemed to see more than the world in front of them. In the days that followed, David tried to bury himself in his work at the clinic, where the steady stream of patients and minor emergencies usually kept his mind occupied. But not today. It was a regular afternoon. The waiting room hummed with low conversations, and the familiar scent of antiseptic clung to the air. David had just finished with a routine checkup when his nurse knocked on the door. "Dr. Mills, there's a woman here. She seems upset," she said, her tone laced with concern. "She says she needs to speak with you right away." David nodded, wiping his hands on a towel, before heading out into the small reception area. His eyes fell on a woman standing near the door, her clothes rumpled and her hair hanging in limp strands around her face. She was thin, almost too thin, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of long, sleepless nights. As David approached, something flickered in the back of his mind. Had he seen her before? The woman's eyes darted around nervously, and when they locked onto him, she seemed to exhale, as though finally finding what she'd been looking for. "Dr. Mills," she whispered, stepping closer. Her voice trembled, her words shaky. "That coffin, the one on the beach." David's stomach tightened instantly. He hadn't spoken about the coffin to anyone outside of the police. How did she know? "I'm sorry, who are you?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. The woman's hand trembled as she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. She handed it to him, and the moment David saw it, his breath caught in his throat. It was the boy on the swing, the very same photograph from the coffin. Her voice broke as she spoke again. "The things in that coffin, they belong to my son." David blinked, his mind struggling to process the sudden wave of information. He glanced from the photograph to the woman, who stood in front of him like a ghost, frail, desperate, haunted. "Your son?" he asked, still unsure what to make of her claim. She nodded, her eyes welling with unshed tears. He went missing. Years ago. That toy, those pictures, they were his. I don't know how they ended up there, but… Her voice faltered, and she pressed a shaking hand to her mouth as if trying to hold herself together. I lost him. David's pulse quickened. The weight of her words pressed down on him, stirring the unease that had been lingering since the morning on the beach. He wanted to ask her 100 questions, but she looked like she might shatter under the pressure of even one. Before he could respond, she turned on her heel, moving quickly toward the door as if fleeing the conversation altogether. Wait! David called, but she was already out the door, her fragile figure disappearing down the street. For a moment, David stood frozen, the photograph still clutched in his hand. The boy's face stared back at him, as if mocking his confusion. He turned to follow her, but by the time he reached the door, the woman was gone. David let out a long breath, feeling the tight coil of anxiety twist in his gut. The air outside seemed too thick, too heavy. There were too many questions, and not a single answer in sight. He returned to his office, the photograph now burning a hole in his mind. The woman's face kept flashing before him, the dark, hollow eyes, the desperation in her voice. He knew that look. He'd seen it before, not in a stranger, but in the boy from the photograph. The connection hit him hard. That was the familiarity, her son's haunted eyes mirrored in her own. His first instinct was to call the police. He needed to let them know about the encounter, to see if they had any record of a missing boy or a grieving mother. But as he dialed, a sinking feeling settled over him. What if she was just a grieving mother? What if she was clutching at anything to ease the pain of her loss? The officer on the line seemed to agree. We get people like that all the time, the man said, his voice crackling through the phone. They hear about something strange, and they try to connect it to their own tragedy. It's sad, but it's usually nothing more than coincidence. David's fingers tightened around the phone. But she knew about the items in the coffin. She knew about the photographs. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That's a little strange, sure. But we have no record of anyone coming forward to claim those items. If she's legitimate, she'll make an official report. David hung up, his frustration mounting. He didn't believe the woman was just a grieving mother grasping at straws. She had known too much, her recognition of the coffin, the toy, and the photographs was too specific to be random. Something was off, and David felt himself getting pulled deeper into it. He glanced at the clock. It was late, and his next patient was due soon. He shoved the photograph into a drawer, determined to push it from his mind for the rest of the day. But it lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind, the boy's face refusing to fade. Even as he saw patients and handed out prescriptions, the thought of that woman, of her son, stayed with him. Hours later, after the last patient had left and the clinic had quieted down, David found himself sitting alone in his office, staring at the drawer where he had tucked away the photograph. He wasn't sure what compelled him, but he pulled it out once more. The boy's eyes looked back at him. And for the first time since he had seen the photograph on the beach, David felt certain there was more to this than coincidence. The day had dragged on longer than David anticipated. By the time he got home, dusk had settled, casting long shadows across the front of the house. Normally, walking through the door brought him a sense of calm, a break from the steady pulse of demands at the clinic. But today, something felt off, like a low hum of anxiety in the back of his mind that he couldn't quite shake. He unlocked the door, pushed it open, and immediately felt it, something was wrong. He stepped into the hallway, his eyes instinctively scanning the space, and that's when he saw it. The dining table, which should have been clean, was littered with photographs. The sight of them sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, he walked toward the table, his eyes narrowing as recognition struck. They were the same photographs from the coffin. David's heart hammered as he approached the table. His mind raced, trying to process what he was seeing. There had been no reason for these photographs to be here. How did they get into his home? Who had brought them here? Nothing else in the house seemed disturbed, yet someone had been inside. This wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was a message. One photograph stood out from the rest, placed deliberately at the center of the table. It was the image that had been burned into David's mind since the day on the beach. The boy on the swing, staring into the camera, his face eerily familiar. He couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the spot, the weight of the moment sinking in. Whoever had done this knew about the coffin, knew about the photographs, and had wanted David to see them again. David? Emily's voice cut through the silence, pulling him out of his thoughts. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost. What is this? Her voice trembled, her gaze fixed on the table. David didn't answer right away. He didn't know what to say. He watched her as she stepped closer, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Her eyes darted over the photographs, and then her body went rigid. She froze, her gaze locked on the photograph at the center of the table, the one of the boy on the swing. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at it, her hand slowly coming up to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible. David rushed to her side, his hand gently gripping her arm. "Emily?" But she didn't respond. Her eyes were wide and glazed, fixed on the photograph like she was seeing something, or someone, she couldn't bear to face. Her breathing grew shallow, her chest heaving as panic set in. "Emily," David said again, this time more firmly, trying to pull her attention away. But she was slipping, her body trembling under the weight of something he didn't understand. Her hand pressed to her chest as she gasped for breath, her skin turning cold to the touch. I can't," she stammered, her words barely forming between the shallow breaths. "David, I can't." Her legs buckled slightly, and David caught her just as she sank into the nearest chair. She was shaking uncontrollably now, her eyes darting from the photograph to the door as if she wanted to flee but couldn't move. "Stay with me, Emily," David said, crouching beside her, his heart racing as he realized she was spiraling into a full-blown panic attack. She clutched at his arm, her breath quickening. She gasped. "I need." David understood instantly. He jumped up and ran to the bathroom, his hands moving quickly as he grabbed her anxiety medication from the cabinet. He returned to her side, pressing the pills into her palm with a glass of water. "Take these," he urged, his voice steady but firm. "Just breathe. You're safe." Emily swallowed the pills with trembling hands, her body shaking so hard that David had to steady the glass for her. She slumped against the back of the chair, her breath still ragged, but gradually slowing as the medication began to take effect. David stayed beside her, rubbing her back gently, his mind racing. He had never seen her react like this, not even during the most stressful times. He had known there was something unsettling about the photograph, but whatever it was had triggered something deep and raw in Emily, something she wasn't ready to talk about yet. Minutes passed, and slowly, Emily's breathing became more even. Her hands, though still trembling, had stopped shaking as violently. She leaned her head back, her eyes closed, but David could tell she was still somewhere far away, her thoughts tangled in whatever had just gripped her so tightly. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked gently. She shook her head, not opening her eyes. "No. I can't. Not right now. David nodded, not wanting to push her. He didn't know what to make of her reaction, whether it was fear, recognition, or something else entirely. But he knew one thing for sure: whoever had broken into their home knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't a random act. They had left these photographs for a reason, and the impact on Emily was too severe to ignore. "I'm going to call the police," he said, standing up. Emily didn't respond, only nodded weakly, her eyes still shut tight. David walked over to the table, looking down at the photograph again, his mind spinning. This was no coincidence. He grabbed his phone, dialing the police, explaining everything: the break-in, the photographs, Emily's reaction. Once again, the officers showed up, this time more serious than before. They searched the house, but there was no sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no clues left behind. Just the photographs on the table, as though someone had walked in and out without leaving a trace. "Could be a prank," one officer suggested. "People hear about strange things, and sometimes mess with you. We'll keep an eye out, though." David nodded, though he didn't believe it was a prank. The house had only just started to settle after the unsettling break-in, the weight of the photographs still hanging over David and Emily like a dark cloud. They tried to return to normal, but the tension lingered, unspoken yet palpable. David sensed it in Emily's distant stares, and the way she flinched whenever the phone rang. He sensed it in himself too, his mind constantly replaying the events, trying to piece together a mystery that refused to take shape. Then, something far worse happened. It started as any other afternoon. Ethan had gone to school, his usual bright, energetic self, his backpack slung over his shoulder as he raced out the door. David had walked him halfway, as he sometimes did, giving his son a reassuring smile before watching him sprint the rest of the way toward the school gates. There was no indication, no warning, that by the end of the day, their lives would be thrown into a deeper chaos. The call came just before dusk. Emily had been pacing near the window, waiting for Ethan to come home, checking her watch more often than usual. She'd called his name down the street, expecting him to be taking his time, maybe stopping to play with a friend. But when the minutes ticked by, and there was no sign of him, her unease morphed into something darker, sharper. David was in the kitchen when he heard her scream. "David! David!" Emily's voice was frantic, and by the time he reached the front door, she was on the phone, pacing in frantic circles. "He's gone. I can't find him. He should have been home by now." David's heart dropped. He rushed out of the house, scanning the street, the park nearby, the familiar route Ethan would take from school to home. But there was nothing. No sign of their son. The police arrived quickly after Emily's call, their blue lights flashing as they gathered information from her, then from David. The hours stretched, painfully. Every neighbor was questioned, every corner of the park and street searched, but there was no trace of Ethan. Emily was inconsolable, her hands trembling as she clutched her phone, waiting for news that wouldn't come. By the time the police officially launched a full search, David's mind had already leapt to the one terrifying thought he couldn't shake: this had something to do with the coffin. The break-in, the photographs, Emily's reaction, they had to be connected to Ethan's disappearance. He didn't have the proof, but his gut told him the truth was buried somewhere in those events. Hours passed, and Emily grew more frantic, her breathing shallow, her face as pale as the photographs that had haunted them. David tried to comfort her, but he had nothing to offer. No answers, no certainty that their son would come home safe. Then, finally, just after midnight, a call came in. Ethan had been found. David and Emily raced to the nearby park, hearts pounding, where an officer met them at the gate. "He's okay," the officer assured them, his voice calm. He's cold, but he's unharmed. They spotted Ethan sitting on a bench, wrapped in a police officer's jacket, his small frame curled up, shivering. But he wasn't hurt. He wasn't injured. When he saw them, he got to his feet, his eyes wide, though strangely distant. Emily rushed to him, wrapping him in her arms, her sobs echoing through the night air as she held him tight. "Where were you, baby?" she whispered between gasps of relief. "Where did you go?" Ethan blinked up at her, his face expressionless. In his hands, he clutched something small, something David recognized instantly. It was the toy. The small, worn wooden airplane from the Coffin. David's blood ran cold. He crouched beside Ethan, carefully placing a hand on his son's shoulder, trying to keep his voice steady. "Ethan, where did you get that?" Ethan looked at him, his face calm but oddly detached. "My friend gave it to me," he said, his voice flat. David exchanged a quick glance with Emily, whose face had drained of color again. "Your friend?" David repeated. "Who's your friend?" Ethan looked away, his gaze drifting toward the trees that surrounded the park. "We played together. I was with him. He said he knew me." David's heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing as he tried to process his son's words. Who was this friend? Why did Ethan have the toy from the Coffin? Before David could ask another question, Emily let out a sharp gasp. She was staring at the toy, her eyes wide and wild. Her hands flew to her mouth as if she was going to scream, but no sound came out. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. David grabbed her arm, trying to steady her. "Emily." She shook her head violently, her body trembling. "No, no, no, no," she murmured, backing away from the sight of the toy in Ethan's hand. "This isn't happening. This can't be happening." David tried to calm her, but her panic escalated. She was on the verge of hyperventilating, her eyes darting between Ethan and the toy, as if she couldn't reconcile what she was seeing. "We need help," David muttered, signaling one of the officers. An ambulance arrived shortly after, and Emily was taken inside, where paramedics administered medication to calm her. David stayed beside her, holding her hand as her body trembled uncontrollably. Whatever connection she had with the events surrounding the Coffin, it was unraveling her, and David had no idea how to stop it. Once Emily was stable, David turned his attention back to Ethan. His son sat quietly, still holding the toy, staring off into the distance. There was something about his stillness that unnerved David, something about the calm way he held the wooden airplane that sent a chill down his spine. "Ethan," he said softly, kneeling in front of him again. "Who is your friend?" Ethan shrugged, still not meeting David's eyes. "He said he knew you and Mom." David's breath caught. His mind raced, grasping for answers, but nothing made sense. Did he say anything else? Where did he go? Ethan shook his head. He didn't say anything else. He just wanted to play. David's heart sank. Whoever, or whatever, this friend was, he had gotten close enough to Ethan to leave a mark. And now, the chilling connection between the Coffin, the photographs, and their son's disappearance was undeniable. David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, Ethan's quiet voice echoed in his mind, "My friend gave it to me." That toy, the same toy from the Coffin, resting in his son's small hands, it was all too much to ignore. And yet, Emily had begged him not to dig any deeper. "I don't want this anymore, David," she had said, her voice strained, tears brimming in her eyes as they sat in the dim light of their bedroom. "Please, just let it go. It's making everything worse." She was fragile. She had been since Ethan's disappearance. But her insistence felt wrong, too strong, too desperate. David could see the fear behind her words, something deeper than just concern for their son's safety. There was a part of Emily that was terrified, but she refused to explain why. That night, as she slept fitfully beside him, David made a decision. He had to find out the truth. The next day, he found himself back at the clinic, staring at the contact information he'd scribbled down after his brief encounter with the woman who had claimed the items in the coffin. She had come into his life so suddenly, with her broken voice and haunted eyes, and then disappeared just as quickly. He hadn't even gotten her name at first, but after some digging, he'd found it: Claire. Against Emily's wishes, David called the number. It rang several times before a quiet, cautious voice answered. "Hello? Claire?" David asked, his voice careful, trying not to alarm her. "It's Dr. Mills. From the clinic." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, the hesitation palpable. "Yes, I remember," she said, her voice soft, like someone who had learned to speak in whispers. "Why are you calling?" David leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "I need to talk to you. About the coffin. About your son." Another pause, longer this time. David heard her take a breath. "I'm not sure how I can help you. But, if you want to meet, we can talk." An hour later, David found himself in front of a modest home on the outskirts of town, a small, nondescript place tucked behind overgrown hedges. It looked lonely, much like the woman he had met. When Claire opened the door, her eyes were just as hollow as he remembered, but there was something else now: resignation. "Come in," she said quietly, leading him to a small sitting room cluttered with old books and faded photographs. David noticed the absence of one particular kind of photo. There were no pictures of her son. "I don't know why you're here," Claire said, her voice thick with exhaustion as she sat across from him. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen." David leaned forward, trying to read her, to find the answers buried beneath the sorrow in her eyes. "You said the things in the coffin belonged to your son." She nodded, her hands twisting together in her lap. "Yes. They did." David swallowed, choosing his next words carefully. "What happened to him?" Claire closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering the strength to revisit a memory that had weighed on her for years. "He drowned," she whispered. "At a summer camp. He was just 8 years old." David sat back, the weight of her words settling in the room like a dense fog. "I'm so sorry," he said softly, not knowing what else to offer. Claire's fingers tightened around the edge of her chair. "He loved the ocean. That summer, I thought sending him to camp would make him happy. But one day, he went out to play with the other kids, and he never came back." David remained silent, letting her speak. "They searched for him," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But it was too late. His body was found washed up on the shore a few days later. The camp never gave me any real answers, just that it was an accident." Her eyes locked onto David's, suddenly sharp and full of pain. "But it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like something I should have been able to stop." David's throat tightened. He could hear the guilt in her voice, the same guilt that had probably followed her every day since. "After his death," Claire said, her gaze drifting toward the window, "I couldn't bear to keep his things. The toy, the photographs, his little journal. They were all too painful. So I placed them in the coffin, and I sent it out to sea. I thought if I let go of them, I could let go of the pain." David nodded slowly. "But the coffin came back." Claire's lips pressed together, her face tightening as she nodded. Yes. I never thought I would see it again. I lost it in a storm, and I assumed it had sunk or drifted far away. But then it washed ashore, near you. David's pulse quickened. Near my son, he murmured, almost to himself. Claire's eyes widened slightly. Yes. I didn't know why at first, but I feel like it's not a coincidence, Dr. Mills. There's something. I don't know how to explain it, but I feel like this coffin, my son's things. They were meant to find you. David stared at her, his mind spinning. It made no sense, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. Too many things had lined up, the photographs, Ethan's strange behavior, the toy he had brought back from his friend. It was as if the coffin had drawn them into something far beyond what they could understand. I don't know why it happened, Claire continued, her voice low and trembling. But when I saw that the coffin had returned, I felt like it was trying to tell me something. That I wasn't finished with my son's death. That there's more to the story. David felt a knot forming in his stomach. But why me? Why my family? I don't know, Claire said, her eyes filled with sorrow. But I don't think it's an accident. Something brought the coffin to you. Maybe it's connected to your son. David felt a chill crawl down his spine. His thoughts raced back to Ethan, to the way his son had held that toy so calmly, how he'd spoken of his friend. Could it be? Could this somehow be tied to Claire's son? He didn't want to believe it, but every piece of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place, leading him further into the unknown. I'm sorry, Claire whispered. I never wanted to pull you into this. But it feels like fate. Later that night, David sat beside Ethan's bed, the soft glow of the bedside lamp casting shadows across the room. Ethan was tucked under the covers, his face calm, almost too calm, as though the events of the past day hadn't touched him in the way they had affected his parents. David studied his son, wondering how a child could seem so untouched by something that had shaken him and Emily to the core. Ethan, David began gently, I need to ask you about what happened when you went missing. Ethan's gaze flickered to him, but he didn't say anything right away. His small hands toyed with the edge of the blanket, his focus distant, as if he was trying to decide whether to answer. David waited patiently, watching the way Ethan's fingers nervously picked at the fabric. Finally, his son spoke. I wasn't alone. David's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean? I met a friend, Ethan continued, his voice quiet but steady. A boy. He asked if I wanted to play, so I went with him. David frowned. Where did you meet this boy? Ethan shrugged, his expression innocent. At the park. He was by the trees. He said he wanted to show me something, so we played. He was really nice. A small smile tugged at Ethan's lips, like he was remembering something fond. David's throat tightened. The park. That's where they'd found Ethan wandering, clutching the toy from the coffin. He felt a chill creep through him, an inexplicable sense of dread growing in his chest. Did he tell you his name? David asked, keeping his voice calm despite the unease rising inside him. Ethan shook his head. No. But he gave me this. He reached out and picked up the small wooden airplane from his bedside table, the same toy that had been inside the coffin. Ethan held it delicately in his hands, as if it were something special, something he cherished. David stared at the toy, his mind racing. Ethan had described the boy as nice, as someone who wanted to play. But it didn't make sense. How could his son have met a boy who matched the description of a child who had drowned years ago? A boy who had once owned the very toy Ethan now clung to? Tell me more about your friend, David said, doing his best to keep his voice steady. Ethan's face lit up. We played all day. We ran through the woods, and then we went to the beach. He showed me how to make a fort with sticks. We built it by the water, but then it started getting dark. His smile faded slightly, his voice softening. He left when it got dark. He didn't say goodbye. I don't know where he went. David felt his heart sink. And that's when we found you in the park? Ethan nodded, his brow furrowing slightly. I didn't know it was that late. I didn't mean to make you and Mom worry. David reached out, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. We were just worried because we didn't know where you were. Ethan nodded, his gaze drifting back to the toy in his hands. He didn't come back, though. Do you think he'll come back to play again? David's blood ran cold. His mind flashed back to Claire's story, the tragic drowning of her son. The photographs. The coffin. Every piece of the puzzle pointed to the same terrifying conclusion: Ethan's friend had to be Claire's son. There was no other explanation that made sense. But how? How could a boy who had died years ago be here, playing with his own child? David swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure. I don't know, Ethan. Maybe he won't come back. Maybe he was just visiting. Ethan didn't seem to understand the weight of David's words. He just nodded, his expression thoughtful, but not troubled. I liked him. He was really nice. David stood, his legs unsteady as he tried to process everything. Get some rest now, okay? We'll talk more tomorrow. Ethan yawned, snuggling deeper into his blankets. Okay, Dad. Good night. David leaned down and kissed the top of his son's head, his heart heavy. Good night, buddy. As he left Ethan's room and quietly closed the door behind him, David felt the weight of the mystery pressing down on him harder than ever. He stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, his thoughts swirling in a chaotic blur of disbelief and fear. How could he explain this? How could he even begin to understand it? The pieces all seemed to fit together, but the answer they formed was something he couldn't wrap his mind around. A spirit? A ghost? David had never believed in anything like that, had always dismissed such ideas as irrational. And yet, here he was, standing in his own home, knowing that the only explanation was something far beyond reason. The boy Ethan described wasn't just a figment of his imagination. He was real, at least, he had been real once. But now, he was something else. Something that had crossed paths with Ethan, drawn him in, played with him like they were old friends. And yet, the boy had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only the toy, as if to remind David that he was there. David leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment, trying to think clearly. He needed to talk to Emily, to figure out what to do next. She had already been so shaken by the break-in, by Ethan's disappearance. He couldn't keep this from her, even though he feared how she might react. He walked quietly into their bedroom, where Emily lay curled up in bed, her face relaxed in sleep, finally at peace after the whirlwind of emotions she'd been through. David stood by the door, watching her, wondering if she would believe him when he told her what Ethan had said. There was no doubt in his mind now: Ethan's disappearance, the photographs, the coffin, the boy, it was all connected. David's thoughts drifted to Claire. If her son's spirit had reached out to Ethan, what did it mean? What did it want? The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains as David sat beside Emily, his heart heavy with the weight of the conversation that was about to unfold. He hadn't slept much, tossing and turning as he replayed Ethan's words in his head, Claire's tragic story, and the strange connection between them all. Now, sitting there, watching Emily stir awake, he knew it was time to tell her everything. Emily blinked sleepily, her eyes finding his, and a faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips before fading, replaced by the quiet concern that had lived in her since the break-in. "You're up early," she murmured, her voice still thick with sleep. David took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We need to talk, Em." She sat up slowly, her expression shifting from sleepy to wary, and David felt the air between them tighten. He couldn't put it off any longer. He needed to tell her what Ethan had said, what Claire had revealed, and what he had begun to suspect. "I talked to Claire again," David started, watching the way Emily stiffened at the mention of the woman. "She told me about her son, about what happened at the camp." Emily's hand went slack in his, her face paling. David kept his voice steady, though his heart ached for her. "Ethan, he met a boy when he disappeared. He said they played together, that the boy gave him the toy from the coffin." Emily's breath hitched, her eyes widening in disbelief. David pressed on, gently but firmly. "I think that boy was Claire's son, Emily. I don't know how it happened or why, but I think he was reaching out to Ethan. Maybe because of the connection. Because of you." Tears welled in Emily's eyes, her lip quivering as she tried to speak. "David." She stopped, choking on her words, her hands trembling in her lap. "I should have told you sooner." David's heart sank, knowing what was coming. He leaned forward, his hand still holding hers, steady and strong. "It's okay, Emily. Whatever it is, just tell me." She drew in a shaky breath, wiping her tears with the back of her hand before meeting his eyes. "I was there that summer. I was the camp counselor in charge when Claire's son drowned." Her voice cracked, her words spilling out in a rush. "It was an accident, David. He slipped away from the group, and we didn't realize he was gone until it was too late." David felt the weight of her confession hit him, a mix of grief and understanding swelling in his chest. Emily had carried this burden for years, hiding it even from him, her guilt wrapping around her like a suffocating blanket. "I blamed myself," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I should have been watching him more closely. I thought I could bury it, forget it, but I couldn't. When I saw the photographs from the coffin, when Ethan mentioned a friend, I knew. It was him." David felt a deep sadness for her, for the years of silent pain she had endured. "It wasn't your fault, Emily. You couldn't have known." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I've been carrying this for so long, David. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I didn't want to bring it back." David pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she sobbed into his chest, years of pent-up guilt and grief spilling out all at once. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," he whispered, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "It's time to let it go." Later that afternoon, they called Claire and asked her to meet them at the beach where the coffin had washed ashore. Claire arrived with a quiet dignity, her eyes heavy with sorrow but somehow lighter now that the truth had come to the surface. Together, the three of them walked along the shoreline, the waves lapping gently at their feet, the sky overhead clear and bright. They carried with them the items from the coffin, the photographs, the toy airplane, and the small journal. This time, there was no storm, no sense of tragedy hanging over them, just a quiet moment of peace as they stood at the edge of the water. Emily knelt down first, gently placing the toy airplane into the water. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling but strong. "I never wanted this for you. I hope you can forgive me." Claire stood beside her, her hand resting on Emily's shoulder, her face soft with understanding. It wasn't your fault. You did everything you could. David watched as the two women shared a look of profound sadness and forgiveness, their shared grief binding them in a way he couldn't fully understand but could deeply respect. They released the photographs and the journal into the sea, watching as the items drifted away with the tide, carried off into the horizon. For the first time in weeks, David felt a strange sense of closure settle over him. The boy's spirit had found its peace, and so had they. Whatever force had brought the coffin back to them had done so with purpose, not to haunt or harm, but to heal. And now, standing on the shore with Emily and Claire, David felt the weight of their collective grief begin to lift. In the days and weeks that followed, life slowly returned to normal for the Mills family. Ethan seemed to understand, in his own way, that something had changed. He spoke of his friend less often, but when he did, it was always with a gentle smile, as if the boy had been a part of his life for a brief, important moment and then quietly moved on. Emily was lighter, too. Though the memory of that summer would never fully leave her, the guilt that had once consumed her had loosened its grip. She and Claire stayed in touch, their bond forged in the most unexpected of ways, both of them knowing that they had faced the darkest part of their past and emerged stronger for it. David, too, had learned something through it all. Some things couldn't be explained by logic or reason, and sometimes the forces of the universe moved in ways that defied understanding. Loss and love, grief and forgiveness, they were threads that wove people's lives together, often in ways they couldn't see until the pieces had all fallen into place. And as David stood on the porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized that sometimes, things happen not by coincidence, but because they were meant to be.